The Welland Heritage Council and Multicultural Centre has begun its Black History celebration with a series of online events this month. Coming on Wednesday, January 9th, our next guest appears on a panel with Kimberly Madumi and Emily Radcliffe. They're the hosts of the Pigmented podcast. We had them on the program last year. Dr. Taylor, what is the focus of your segment with the ladies on Wednesday?
First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I really appreciate this opportunity. So the big thing is for us to rethink and reimagine Black History Month, because typically 11 months of the year, we're not talking about Black history. Then all of a sudden, January 31st, it's like, oh my gosh, February 1st is around the corner. We need to talk about something. So the big conversation that we're going to have is really thinking about how can we expand these 28 and sometimes 29 days to have a conversation of Blackness and Black people as Canadians, as equal and equitable members of our society. So that's our big push of the conversation on the 9th.
The goal then really should be not having to have a Black History Month, but to have it as part of the fabric of our society.
Exactly. And my argument has always been, if we're in a high school classroom and we have, say, for example, grade 11 history, we shouldn't just be learning about the intersections of Black people and the big names. We shouldn't just be learning about Lincoln Alexander in February. We should be learning about Lincoln Alexander next to all the quote unquote great Canadians. When we have the conversations about the point system, when we have the conversations about, for example, how Canada came to be in 1867, when we're talking about Indigenous relations, we need to be also framing where were Black people at this time. So eventually, hopefully at some point, Black people become just a regular part of our Canadian mosaic.
In your eyes, has there been any progress made for us getting closer to those points?
I think the fact that we're able to have this conversation. I mean, if we really think about this, pulling the layers back, just for me to be able to sitting here having this conversation with you, Mike, to say, hey, maybe Black History Month per se isn't the best way to go about this. Imagine somebody like myself having this conversation even 5-10 years ago. It would be like, what are you talking about? We need this month. However, I'm framing in a way to say, yes, we need to recognize Black folk, but we need to embed it across what we do. And I really think, post May 25th, 2020, we are now able to engage with this conversation on everyday issues.
Dr. Taylor, you mentioned the Indigenous community there. Does the Black community work together in tandem with the Indigenous community to push for more diversity and inclusion?
And Mike, that's a fantastic question, because even in the space that I work in, so for example, equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism, in order for these pieces to work, in order for us to confront and understand anti-Black racism and the place of Black people in Canada, we have to understand settler colonialism. We have to understand that we, as Black folks in the Americas, were brought here as enslaved peoples on stolen Indigenous land on Turtle Island. So our liberation, our emancipation is hand in hand with Indigenous reconciliation. Without Indigenous reconciliation, there is no Black emancipation. So they work hand in hand. And that's a key conversation that we have to have, is that not one or the other, but when we're talking about the two-row wampum, we have to run in parallel in order for us to all be free.
Your title that you mentioned, diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been a job at a university. And one would hope that 20 years from now, there wouldn't need to be that job at any universities. Am I correct in that assumption?
I tell folks all the time, and a lot of people think I'm facetious and I'm joking, but the success of these roles and my success is essentially working myself out of a job. The whole end game is not to say, hey, what are we going to be doing on equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism in 20 years, in 30 years? I'm not sitting here to create a career out of this work. My whole goal is to get to a point that we're embedding these principles of equity, diversity, inclusion, that we are getting to a space of decolonization and anti-racism that I become obsolete.
With the efforts of organizations like the Welland Heritage Council and Multicultural Centre, how do you get involved? How do you help them out beyond just this February 9th appearance?
My thing is always to be a resource. And particularly being in the education sphere, I'm always focused about supporting students. Students, youth, young people, I know we, we joke about this, but they're our future. They have the energy, they have the minds, they're pushing. So for me to always be a constant resource, whether it's January 1st, whether it's July 2nd, I'm always here to support them. I'm always here to support and lend an ear as a resource for research, for understanding, to contextualize what some of these young people and what some of these organizations are facing. Because a lot of the times, these organizations are volunteer, they don't have the capacity, and they need folks like myself to support them and create these links between academia, larger institutions, to understand that we are all in this together.
Talking about yourself again, being a black man at the university as a professor, as someone who's working at the university, just having your presence there. I was a high school teacher for 29 years, and I can't remember when I last worked with another teacher who was black.
It's interesting because I don't always want to sit back with this, what we call black achievers. The representation is the end game. We have one black this and one black that. We always celebrate the first. But my whole thing is, I don't want to be the first or the second or the third. I want us to be in a space where high school kids, university students, elementary students don't have to look up and say, hey, I've never had a black professor before or a black teacher. It just becomes something that is, like I was saying with Black History Month, it becomes the quote unquote norm of their very existence. And yes, it is a challenge because, say, for example, months like this, when you are the only black or the first black or whatever, people always want to pull you for your time and for your energy to really focus on these particular issues. My whole thing is, when we talk about Black History Month, this is just not a black thing or a white thing. This is all our things. These are all our issues, all our concerns. And that's where I really want to get forward in our thinking about Black History Month.
Do you have a lot of hope in this next generation that you're currently teaching at University of Waterloo?
I mean, hope is a funny word, right? Hope. I want to say yes. However, my whole thing is we have to have plans in place. What is happening? What are some of the stop gaps? How are we really understanding these particular issues? So I want to say, yes, I have hope, because if I didn't have hope, I would not exist. One of my ancestors who were enslaved, if they were on that ship and they did not have hope, when they're on that plantation and they did not have hope, I would not exist. So for me to say, well, you know what, this is not going to work, this is not going to happen, that is doing a disservice to the long generation of people that came before me who had hope.
Dr. Taylor, I wish we had way more time to talk about this. Fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Mike, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.